The dust of redemption was a living thing. It was the color of rust and bone, a fine powder that coated every surface, filled the air, and gritted between the teeth. It rose in lazy plumes from the hooves of listless horses tied to hitching posts, and settled in the creases of faces worn hard by sun and disappointment. The town itself was little more than a single, wide scar of a street gouged into the plains, flanked by raw timber buildings that seemed to lean on one another for support against the relentless wind. Heat shimmered above the cracked earth, warping the horizon into a wavering, indefinite line. This was a place where hope came to die, and Alara felt its brittle remains crunching under the soles of her thin, ruined shoes. She huddled in the narrow alley between the saloon and the mercantile, a space that smelled of sour whiskey, stale beer, and the cloying sweetness of decay. The thin fabric of what was once a wedding dress, now a gray and tattered shroud, offered little protection from the chill that seeped from the shaded earth, a stark contrast to the hammer of the sun in the main street. Her hunger was a hollow, aching thing, a creature gnawing at her insides, so profound it had consumed all other thoughts, all other griefs. The memory of her husband, Thomas, of his quick smile and the fever that had taken him even quicker, was a distant watercolor, faded by the stark, immediate reality of starvation. He had promised her a garden, a home, a life. He had left her with nothing but his name and a dress meant for a celebration, now a uniform of her destitution. Men spilled from the saloon, their laughter coarse and loud. It scraped against her raw nerves. She pressed herself deeper into the shadows, making herself smaller, trying to become invisible. Through the swinging doors, she could see the warm glow of lanterns, hear the discordant plink of a piano, and most torturously, smell the rich aroma of frying meat. The scent was a physical blow, making her stomach clench with a pain so sharp it brought tears to her eyes. She had tried asking. She had stood before the mercantile owner, her voice a dry whisper, and been met with a flat, pitiless stare. She had approached the blacksmith's wife, who had shooed her away as if she were a stray dog. They saw the dress, the dirt, the desperation, and they judged. A lone woman was a problem, a burden, an invitation to trouble they wanted no part of. The saloon's back door creaked open, and a burly man with a stained apron emerged, carrying a bucket. He barely glanced at her as he tossed its contents, a slurry of food scraps, coffee grounds, and dirty water, onto the already squalid ground. He went back inside, the door slamming shut. Alara stared at the heap. A crust of bread, a few withered potato peels, something that might have been meat. Shame warred with the savage, primal need that clawed at her throat. The shame lost. Her hands trembled as she knelt in the filth, her fingers closing around the damp crust of bread. It was gritty with dirt, but it was food. She brought it to her lips, her eyes squeezed shut against the humiliation that burned hotter than the sun. A shadow fell over her. She froze, the bread halfway to her mouth, her heart seizing in her chest. She had not heard him approach. Slowly, she looked up. He was tall, his frame lean but broad in the shoulders, outlined against the harsh light of the alley's mouth. His face was obscured by the wide brim of a sweat-stained hat, but she could feel the weight of his gaze. He was a stranger, not one of the town's familiar, cruel faces. He had the stillness of the mountains that loomed on the far horizon, a quiet solidity that was more intimidating than any loud threat. He had seen her. He had witnessed the absolute depth of her degradation. A fresh wave of shame washed over her, so powerful it threatened to drown her. She expected a sneer, a cruel word, a kick of a dusty boot. It was what she had come to expect from this world. He did none of those things. He simply stood there, watching her, his expression unreadable in the deep shadows of his hat. His silence was immense, stretching the moment into an eternity. He carried several large canvas sacks, clearly a man in from some distant homestead for supplies. One hand rested near the worn leather holster at his hip, not as a threat, but as a natural posture of a man accustomed to solitude and self-reliance. Alara remained frozen on her knees, the dirty bread clutched in her hand, a tableau of utter despair. The sounds of the saloon, the laughter, the music, seemed to fade away, leaving only the oppressive silence between them, the whisper of the wind, and the frantic, terrified beating of her own heart. He had seen her at her most wretched, and in his silence, she felt not the sharp sting of mockery, but the heavy, unendurable weight of witness. She could not bear it. Her gaze dropped back to the dirt, and she waited for the inevitable blow, in whatever form it might take. His boots scraped against the hard-packed earth as he took a single step closer. The sound was deafening in the charged silence. Alara flinched, curling into herself, a reflexive gesture of defense learned over weeks of hardship. She braced for the impact, for the final cruelty that would surely break what little was left of her spirit. But instead of a kick or a curse, she heard the soft thud of a canvas sack landing on the ground beside her. It was one of his supply bags. The scent of fresh-baked bread, flour, and smoked bacon wafted from it, an aroma so pure and wholesome it was an agony to her starved senses. "Eat," a voice said. It was low and rough, like stones grinding together, a voice unused to speaking. The single word hung in the air, impossibly gentle despite its gruffness. Alara's head snapped up, her eyes wide with disbelief. She stared at the sack, then back at the man. His face was still shadowed, a landscape of planes and angles carved by wind and solitude. He made no move to leave, no move to come closer. He simply stood, waiting. The command was not harsh. It was a simple statement of fact, an instruction for survival. Her mind, foggy with hunger, struggled to comprehend the gesture. Kindness was a foreign currency in this place, and she had long since been rendered bankrupt. Suspicion, ingrained by weeks of cruelty, coiled in her gut. No one gave anything for free. Why? The word was a dry rasp, torn from her throat. He did not answer immediately. He shifted his weight, the leather of his gun belt creaking softly. No woman should eat from the dirt. The statement was delivered without sentiment, a plain observation of how the world ought to be, even if it wasn't. It wasn't pity in his voice. It was something harder, something that bordered on offense. As if her debasement was a violation of some unspoken code he lived by. He nudged the sack again with the toe of his boot. "It's yours." Her trembling fingers released the filthy crust she had been clutching. Slowly, cautiously, as if expecting the bag to be snatched away, she reached for it. The canvas was rough under her fingertips. She fumbled with the knot at the top, her fingers clumsy and weak. Inside, nestled amongst bags of flour and beans, was a whole loaf of bread, still slightly warm from the baker's oven. She pulled it out, holding it with a reverence she might once have reserved for a holy book. The smell alone was intoxicating. She broke off a piece and brought it to her lips, her movements jerky and desperate. The bread was soft, real. It filled her mouth, and as she chewed, a sob of pure, unadulterated relief escaped her. She ate ravenously, tearing off pieces and forcing them down, not caring that tears were streaming down her face, mingling with the dust on her cheeks. The man watched her, his stillness unbroken. He did not look away from her desperate, ugly display of hunger. He simply watched, his presence a silent anchor in her swirling chaos of relief and shame. When she had devoured nearly half the loaf, the initial savagery of her hunger abated, leaving a deep, resonant ache. She slowed, her breathing still ragged. She looked at him, the half-eaten loaf clutched to her chest like a shield. "I have no way to pay you," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible shake of his head. Didn't ask for payment. He gestured with his chin back toward the main street, where his wagon and 2 sturdy mules were tied. "I'm heading out. Back to my claim. It's a 2-day ride." He paused, and she felt the weight of his next words before he even spoke them. "You stay here, you'll be dead by winter. Or worse." It was the truth. She knew it in her bones. The nights were already growing colder, and she had no shelter, no prospects. The town's charity had proven to be a shallow, empty well. Her future here was a slow, agonizing descent into nothingness. "Come with me," he said. It wasn't a question or a plea. It was an offer, laid out as plainly as the supplies in his wagon. "There's work, a roof, food in your belly." Fear, cold and sharp, pierced through the warm haze of the food. Go with this stranger? This silent, formidable man who appeared from nowhere? Go with him into the wilderness, to a place she did not know, completely at his mercy? Every instinct screamed at the danger. She was a woman alone, vulnerable. But then she looked around the filthy alley, at the refuse she had been about to eat, and she looked back at the town that had turned its back on her. The danger here was certain, a slow, grinding death by indifference. The danger with him was unknown, a gamble. For the first time in weeks, she was being offered a choice beyond how she would suffer. She saw the townspeople who passed the alley's mouth, the way their eyes would flicker towards her and then quickly away, their faces hardening into masks of contemptuous pity. They would let her starve. This man, this stranger, had not. He had offered her dignity when she had none left. His actions, stark and simple, spoke louder than any reassuring words a more charming man might have offered. He had given her bread. Now he was offering her a chance. Her gaze met the sliver of his face she could see. She could not discern his eyes, but she felt their intensity. She stood up, her legs unsteady. She was still clutching the bread. She took a deep breath, the dust and the hope and the fear all mingling in her lungs. "All right," she said, her voice barely audible but firm. The decision, once made, settled in her with a surprising weight of finality. She had nothing to lose but a life that was already lost. She would take the unknown over the certain. She would go with him. The journey was a silent one. He helped her onto the wagon seat, his touch brief and impersonal on her elbow, and then he was beside her, taking up the reins. He did not speak again as he guided the mules out of Redemption. Alara did not look back. There was nothing there for her to see. The town shrank behind them, becoming just another smudge of brown against an endless expanse of brown earth and pale, washed-out sky. The landscape that opened up before them was vast and intimidating, a place of stark, raw beauty and immense indifference. Jagged hills clawed at the horizon, their slopes dotted with tenacious, scrubby trees. The wind was a constant presence, a low moan that whispered through the tall, dry grasses and tugged at the loose strands of her hair. She sat rigidly on the wagon bench, clutching the sack with the remainder of her bread. The man beside her, Silas, he had offered his name in a single, clipped word as they left town, seemed a part of this landscape. He was as weathered and unyielding as the rock formations they passed. He handled the mules with an easy, practiced competence, his movements economical and sure. He seemed to scan the horizon constantly, his eyes missing nothing, but he never looked at her. The silence between them was not awkward. It was as vast and natural as the sky above. It was a silence born of solitude, and she understood, instinctively, that it was his natural state. For Alara, the silence was a canvas onto which she projected all her fears. Who was this man? What did he truly want from her? The questions circled endlessly in her mind. Yet, beneath the fear, a strange sense of calm began to take root. Out here, away from the judging eyes of the town, she could breathe. The sheer scale of the wilderness dwarfed her own small miseries. The gnawing hunger in her belly was gone, replaced by the solid weight of the bread she had eaten. Her body, exhausted and abused for so long, finally began to relax into the rhythmic jostling of the wagon. As the sun began to dip towards the horizon, painting the sky in brutal strokes of orange and purple, Silas pulled the wagon to a halt near a small, clear stream sheltered by a grove of cottonwoods. "We'll make camp here," he said, his voice startling her out of her reverie. He swung down from the wagon with a fluid grace and began unhitching the weary mules, leading them to the water. He moved with a purpose that left no room for hesitation. Alara watched him for a moment, unsure of her role. She was a passenger, a piece of cargo he had picked up. She felt useless. Then, a flicker of her old self, the woman who had planned to build a home with Thomas, stirred within her. She would not be a burden. She slid down from the wagon, her legs stiff. While he tended to the animals, she gathered dry twigs and branches for a fire. By the time he returned, she had a small pile ready. He glanced at it, then at her, a flicker of something, surprise, approval, in his eyes. It was gone as quickly as it came. He took out a tinderbox and a flint and, with a few practiced strikes, coaxed a small flame to life. As dusk settled, deepening the shadows and bringing a chill to the air, he cooked. He sliced bacon from a slab and fried it in a heavy skillet over the fire. He mixed flour and water in a tin bowl and made thick, flat biscuits, baking them in the hot bacon grease. The smell was heavenly, a promise of sustenance and warmth. He served her a portion on a tin plate, a generous helping of bacon and 2 biscuits, along with a cup of hot, black coffee. They ate in silence. The only sounds the crackle of the fire and the gentle murmur of the stream. The food was simple, but to Alara, it was a feast. Each bite was a reassurance, a small victory against the starvation that had nearly claimed her. When they had finished, he cleaned the skillet and plates with sand from the creek bank, his movements efficient. He laid out a bedroll for himself near the fire and gestured with his head toward the back of the wagon. "You can sleep there. It's warmer." She climbed into the wagon bed, pulling a rough wool blanket he had left for her up to her chin. The wood of the wagon was hard beneath her, but it felt safer than the open ground. She watched him as he sat by the fire, a rifle resting across his lap. He wasn't sleeping. He was watching the darkness, his silhouette a solid, reassuring presence against the flickering light. He was a man accustomed to vigils. For the first time in months, since Thomas's final, ragged breath, Alara felt a sliver of safety. It was a fragile, tentative feeling, but it was there. She was in the care of a capable, serious man. Her fate was tied to his, for now. As she drifted off to sleep, the last thing she saw was his still, watchful form, a lone guardian in the vast, dark wilderness. The second day of travel was a mirror of the first. Silence, the rhythmic creak of the wagon, the endless, magnificent landscape. They climbed higher, into the foothills of the mountains that had once been a distant promise on the horizon. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The scent of pine and damp earth replaced the dusty smell of the plains. Alara felt a strange sense of anticipation building. She was traveling toward a new life, or at least, the continuation of one. What would she find at his homestead? A rough cabin? A simple lean-to? She tried to picture it, but her imagination failed her. Her world had become so small, confined to the alley and the street in Redemption, that the idea of a home was an abstract concept. Late in the afternoon, Silas pointed ahead. There. At first, she saw nothing but a dense stand of pines on a gentle slope. Then, as they drew closer, she saw it. Tucked into a small, sheltered valley, almost swallowed by the wilderness, was a cabin. It was not a rough shack, but a sturdy, well-built structure of notched logs, chinked neatly with mud and moss. A thin curl of smoke rose from a stone chimney, indicating he had banked the fire before he left. A small, tidy barn stood nearby, and a fenced corral held a single, sturdy-looking horse. The entire place radiated a sense of order and permanence, a small bastion of human will carved out of the untamed land. It was a place of profound solitude. There were no other signs of life for miles in any direction, just the trees, the mountains, and the immense, silent sky. Silas brought the wagon to a halt in front of the cabin. "We're here." He swung down and began unhitching the mules without another word, his movements betraying a deep weariness from the journey. Alara remained seated, taking it all in. This was his home. This was her sanctuary, or her prison. She did not yet know which. The cabin door was made of thick, axe-hewn planks. The windows were small, covered not with glass but with greased parchment, giving them a soft, opaque glow. It was a fortress, built for survival. She slid from the wagon, her legs aching. The air here was cool and crisp. She took a deep breath. It felt clean, pure. Silas led the mules toward the barn, leaving her standing alone in the yard. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of being an intruder, a foreign element in this self-contained world he had built. She smoothed down her tattered dress, an unconscious gesture of propriety. What was she supposed to do? Where was she supposed to go? The cabin door opened. She had not even heard him approach it. He stood in the doorway, his large frame filling it. He looked at her, his expression as unreadable as ever. Inside, she hesitated for only a moment before obeying, ducking under the low lintel. The interior was dark and cool after the brightness outside. It took her eyes a moment to adjust. The cabin consisted of a single room, but it was larger than she had expected. It was meticulously clean and orderly. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A rough-hewn table and 2 chairs stood in the center of the room. A bed, built into the far wall, was covered with a thick pile of furs. Shelves holding tins, jars, and a few books lined another wall. Every object had its place. There was no clutter, no waste. It was the home of a man who lived a deliberate, pared-down existence. It was overwhelmingly masculine, smelling of wood smoke, leather, and pine. Silas came in behind her, carrying 2 of the supply sacks. He set them on the table with a heavy thud. "The loft is yours," he said, gesturing with his head toward a sturdy ladder leading to a small, dark space above. "There's a mattress and blankets." She looked up at the loft, then back at him. He was already turning away, beginning to unload the rest of the wagon, his focus entirely on the tasks that needed to be done. He had given her a space, a designation. The loft. She was not a guest. She was an occupant. The distinction was subtle but important. She climbed the ladder, her movements clumsy in the unfamiliar space. The loft was small, tucked under the eaves of the roof. A simple straw-stuffed mattress lay on the floorboards, along with a neat pile of wool blankets. A small, shuttered opening in the wall provided the only light. It was sparse, but it was a space of her own. It was more than she had had in a very long time. She sat on the edge of the mattress, the straw rustling beneath her. Below, she could hear the sounds of Silas moving about, putting away supplies, the quiet, efficient noises of a man at home in his world. She was an anomaly here, a disruption to his solitary rhythm. The weight of her obligation to him pressed down on her. He had saved her, fed her, given her shelter. She owed him a debt she could never repay. She did not know the terms of this arrangement. He had said there was work, but he had not specified what. She was at his mercy, a fact that was both terrifying and, in a strange way, a relief. For now, all she had to do was survive. And for the first time in a long time, survival seemed possible. She lay back on the mattress, pulling a blanket over her filthy dress, and closed her eyes. The exhaustion of the journey, of the weeks of starvation and fear, finally claimed her, and she fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, safe, for now, under the roof of the silent stranger. The first days passed in a haze of sleep and quiet observation. Alara's body, so long deprived, seemed to demand payment. She slept for hours in the loft, a deep, healing sleep, and woke only to the smell of coffee or food. Silas would leave a plate for her on the table, a piece of smoked meat, a thick slice of bread, before he left for the day. He rose before the sun, and she would hear the quiet sounds of his morning routine, the scrape of his boots on the floorboards, the splash of water from the basin, the soft click of the cabin door as he left. He never woke her. He simply provided, and then he disappeared into the vast wilderness that was his true home. When she was awake, she moved about the small cabin like a ghost. She was acutely aware of her status as an outsider. This was his space, every object in it placed by his hand, for his purpose. She touched nothing. She merely watched and listened and began to understand the rhythm of his life. He was a man of immense industry. From the small window in her loft, she could see him chopping wood, his axe rising and falling with a relentless, hypnotic beat. She watched him mending a section of the corral fence, his movements precise and economical. He worked from dawn until dusk, a tireless battle against the encroaching wilderness and the coming winter. Her strength began to return, slowly at first, then with a surprising rush. The food, the sleep, the safety, they were a potent medicine. With strength came a renewed sense of self, and with that, a desperate need for purpose. She could not simply be a kept thing, a creature he fed and sheltered out of some inscrutable sense of duty. She had to contribute. She had to earn her place. She started with the cabin. While he was out, she swept the floorboards until they were free of every speck of dust and dirt. She wiped down the table and the shelves. She washed the few dishes he used and stacked them neatly. These were small acts, but they were hers. They were a way of imposing her own small piece of order onto his world. When he returned at dusk, covered in sweat and sawdust, he would stop in the doorway, his eyes sweeping the room. He never commented on the changes, the cleanliness. But she saw the way his gaze lingered for a moment on the neatly swept hearth, the way his shoulders seemed to relax, just a fraction. His silence was not one of disapproval. One morning, she found the courage to venture outside while he was working nearby. The air was cool and sharp, filled with the scent of pine. She walked to the edge of the small clearing, to a patch of earth that caught the morning sun. The soil looked dark and rich. An idea took root. She remembered the garden she and Thomas had planned, the neat rows of vegetables they had dreamed of. She turned and saw Silas watching her from the woodpile, his axe resting at his side. He had stopped working. His gaze was questioning. She swallowed, her throat suddenly dry. "The soil," she said, her voice small. "It looks good here. For a garden." He looked at the patch of earth, then back at her. For a long moment, he said nothing, and she felt a flush of embarrassment. It was a foolish, domestic thought in this harsh, wild place. He was a man who survived on hunting and trapping, on what he could take from the land, not what he could coax from it. "It's late in the season," he said finally, his voice flat. "I know," she replied, a hint of defiance creeping into her tone. "But maybe for some greens. For winter. If there were seeds." He stared at her, his expression unreadable. Then, without another word, he turned and walked to the barn. She watched him go, her heart sinking. She had overstepped. She had presumed. She was about to turn and retreat to the cabin when he emerged from the barn. He walked toward her, carrying a spade and a small, cloth sack. He stopped in front of her and held them out. "There's a crate in the barn," he said. "From the last owner. Some things left behind." He dropped the small sack into her hands. It was heavy, and it rattled softly. "Seeds. The spade is heavy, but the ground is soft here." He turned and walked back to the woodpile, picked up his axe, and resumed his work as if the conversation had never happened. Alara stood frozen for a moment, the weight of the spade and the sack of seeds in her hands. It was permission. It was more than permission. It was a gift, a space of her own to cultivate. She looked down at the seeds, then at his broad, working back. He had not just given her a task. He had given her a piece of the future, a reason to look beyond the next meal, the next sunrise. He had given her a patch of earth to call her own. A quiet understanding passed between them, unspoken but profound. He would provide the protection and the heavy labor. She would provide the touch that could make this stark place a home. A rhythm was beginning to form, a silent partnership built on shared tasks and the common goal of survival. The garden became her world. She turned the soil with the heavy spade, her muscles screaming in protest at first, then slowly hardening to the task. The physical labor was cleansing. It scoured the lingering shame and fear from her mind, leaving only the satisfying ache of honest work. She found the crate in the barn, as he had said. Inside, along with some rusted tools and other forgotten items, were several packets of seeds, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, hardy lettuces, turnips, beans. They were old, but she planted them with a hopeful prayer, tending the small plot with a fierce devotion. Each day, she would carry buckets of water from the nearby creek, her steps growing stronger and more confident. The small patch of tilled earth became a symbol of her own reclamation. She was no longer the broken creature from the alley in redemption. She was a woman planting a garden. Silas never interfered with her work, but she knew he watched. Sometimes, when she looked up from her weeding, she would find him standing at the edge of the woods, or by the corral, his gaze on her. He would quickly look away, as if she had caught him at something. One evening, he returned from a day of checking his trap lines and found she had used some smooth, flat stones to create a border around her garden plot. He stopped and looked at it for a long time. Later that night, as they ate their silent meal, he spoke. "The deer will come for the greens," he said. She looked up, her heart sinking. She hadn't thought of that. "I'll build a fence tomorrow," he added, and then returned to his food. The next day, he spent the entire morning cutting and sharpening long, thin saplings. By evening, a sturdy, rustic fence encircled her small garden, a protective barrier against the wilderness. He had done it without being asked, anticipating a need she hadn't even considered. The gesture was so profound, so deeply practical and caring, that it left her speechless. That night, she took extra care with their meal, adding some wild herbs she had found growing near the creek to the stew. When she served him, their eyes met across the table for a brief, unguarded moment. A flicker of warmth, of gratitude from her, of something akin to quiet satisfaction from him. The silence between them was changing. It was no longer a void, but a shared space, filled with the weight of these small, unspoken kindnesses. Her transformation was not just internal. The sun and the wind had colored her pale skin, and the hard work had brought a new strength to her limbs. She had found some of Thomas's abandoned things in the bottom of her small travel trunk, a pair of his trousers and a worn linen shirt. She had cut and stitched them to fit her, the practical garments far more suited to her new life than the tattered remains of her wedding dress. She had washed the dress carefully and folded it away, a relic of a past life that no longer seemed to belong to her. When she looked at her reflection in a bucket of still water, she saw a stranger, a woman with calloused hands, sun-streaked hair, and eyes that were no longer haunted by fear, but were clear and direct. One evening, a piece of his world opened up to her. He was cleaning his rifle by the firelight, his large hands moving with an expert familiarity over the metal and wood. On the shelf above the hearth, she had noticed a small, carved wooden bird. It was simple but beautifully rendered, every feather captured with a careful, patient hand. "Did you make this?" she asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. He stopped his work and looked up at the bird, then back at her. He gave a single, sharp nod. "It's beautiful," she said. He did not reply, but he did not immediately return to his task either. He seemed to be considering her words. "My father taught me," he said after a long pause. "Keeps the hands busy in the winter." It was the most he had ever offered about his past. A father, a memory of winter. It was a tiny crack in the formidable wall of his solitude. She felt an urge to ask more, to press for details, but she resisted. She knew that with a man like Silas, information was not something to be demanded. It was a gift, offered in its own time. She simply nodded and watched as he returned to his work, the silence settling around them once more, but now it felt different. It was the silence of two people sharing a room, a fire, a nascent history. He was no longer just her savior, the silent stranger. He was Silas, a man who had a father, who carved birds in the winter, and who built fences around gardens. And she was Alara, a woman who was learning that a home was not something you were given, but something you built, one small, determined act at a time. The first storm of the season arrived without warning. One afternoon, the sky, which had been a placid blue, turned a bruised, malevolent purple. The wind began to howl through the pines, a low, mournful sound that seemed to snake its way through the cracks in the cabin walls. Silas, who had been splitting the last of the logs from a felled tree, stopped his work, his head tilted, listening. "Get inside," he said, his voice sharp with an urgency she had never heard before. "Bring in the water buckets." She hurried to obey, her heart beginning to pound in time with the rising wind. The air had grown heavy and cold, charged with a strange, electric energy. As she latched the cabin door behind them, the first drops of rain, thick and cold as ice, began to spatter against the parchment windows. Within minutes, the rain became a torrential downpour, a solid sheet of water that blurred the entire world outside into a gray, roaring chaos. Thunder cracked overhead, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the very foundations of the cabin. The storm trapped them inside, shrinking their world to the four sturdy walls of the small room. The dim light from the windows faded, plunging the cabin into a deep twilight, though it was only mid-afternoon. Silas lit a lantern, its warm, golden glow pushing back against the gloom. The fire in the hearth roared, fighting the chill that seeped in from the outside. The constant, deafening noise of the storm, the lash of the rain, the howl of the wind, the crash of thunder, made conversation impossible, even if they had been inclined to it. They existed in a small bubble of warmth and light, besieged by the fury of the wilderness. Alara found herself unnerved, not by the storm, but by the forced proximity. There was nowhere to go, no work to do to distract herself. She sat on one of the chairs by the table, her hands clasped in her lap, while Silas stood by the window, peering out into the maelstrom. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he stood poised, as if expecting an attack. This was his enemy, the raw, untamable power of nature, a force that could undo all his hard work in a single, violent outburst. As hours passed, and the storm showed no sign of abating, a strange intimacy settled over the room. The shared experience of being sheltered together against a common foe created a new kind of bond. The silence was no longer about a lack of words, but about a shared state of being. Eventually, Silas turned from the window. The lines of tension around his eyes had eased slightly. The cabin was holding. He moved to the hearth and added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. He did not return to the window. Instead, He sat in the other chair, the one opposite her. The small table was the only thing between them. In the flickering firelight, his face was a geography of shadows and plains. The harshness was softened, the solitude in his eyes replaced by a deep weariness. "It will pass by morning," he said, his voice a low rumble beneath the storm's roar. "This is just the first one. The winter storms are worse." She nodded, her gaze dropping to her hands. "I've never seen anything like it." They fell silent again, but the quality of it had changed once more. It was a contemplative silence, encouraged by the storm's fury. She found herself thinking of Thomas, of the life they were supposed to have had. The grief, which had been buried under the more immediate needs of survival, surfaced, but it was different now. It was a dull, distant ache, not the sharp, crippling pain it had once been. She felt a pang of guilt for that, for the way her life was moving on without him. "You were married," Silas stated. It was not a question. He had seen the dress. Alara looked up, surprised by his directness. "Yes," the word felt strange on her tongue. "His name was Thomas. He took a fever on the trail out here." It was fast. She looked into the fire, seeing the images flicker in the flames. He had such plans. A farm. A family. He believed in the promise of this land. She gave a small, sad smile. He was a dreamer. "Dreamers don't last long out here," Silas said, but there was no cruelty in his voice. It was a simple, hard-earned truth. "No," she agreed softly. "They don't." She looked at him, at his capable hands, his steady gaze. He was the opposite of a dreamer. He was a survivor. "And you, Silas? Have you always been alone?" The question hung in the air between them, bold and intensely personal. She immediately regretted asking it, for prying into the solitude he so clearly valued. She expected him to ignore her, to retreat back into his silence. But he didn't. He stared into the fire for a long time, his expression unreadable. "I had a family once," he said, his voice so low she had to strain to hear him over the wind. "A wife. A daughter." He paused, and the silence that followed was heavier than any before. "They were headed to Oregon. I was scouting for the wagon train. Comanches hit the slow wagons at the back. By the time we turned around," he didn't need to finish the sentence. The story was etched in the deep lines on his face, in the profound, abiding loneliness in his eyes that she had mistaken for simple stoicism. An immense wave of sorrow washed over her, not for herself, but for him. For the unimaginable loss that had carved him into the man he was, that had driven him to this solitary mountain, to build a fortress against a world that had taken everything from him. Her own grief suddenly felt small and manageable in comparison. She understood now. She understood the silence, the watchfulness, the fierce self-reliance. It was not a choice, it was a scar. She didn't know what to say. Words were useless in the face of such a loss. So she said nothing. Instead, she reached across the small table and, for the first time, she touched him. She laid her hand gently on his, where it rested on the rough wood. His hand was large, calloused, and warm. He flinched at the contact, a barely perceptible tremor, but he did not pull away. They sat there for a long time as the storm raged outside, their hands connected in the warm, flickering light of the fire, two solitary survivors finding a moment of shared humanity in the heart of the wilderness. The touch was a quiet acknowledgement of the pain they both carried, a silent promise that they were no longer entirely alone in it. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving a world washed clean and glistening. The air was sharp and cold, carrying the scent of wet earth and pine. When Silas opened the cabin door, the early morning light spilled in, bright and clear. The fury of the night had passed, leaving a profound peace in its wake. But the peace was short-lived. As Silas stepped outside to survey the damage, his body went rigid. Alara, standing in the doorway behind him, followed his gaze. A large pine at the edge of the clearing had been struck by lightning, its trunk split and blackened. That wasn't what held his attention. Near the fallen tree, a section of the corral fence was smashed, the rails splintered as if by a giant hand. His horse was gone. "Stay inside," he said, his voice tight and low. He grabbed his rifle from its pegs by the door and moved out into the clearing, his eyes scanning the damp ground, the tree line, every shadow. Alara's heart pounded. The missing horse was a disaster. It was their only means of fast travel, their connection to the distant world, their escape if one was ever needed. But it was Silas's reaction that truly frightened her. This was not the quiet concern of a man who had lost livestock. This was the coiled tension of a man facing a threat. He knelt, examining the ground near the broken fence. He wasn't looking for hoof prints. He was looking for boot prints. He found them. He stood slowly, his face a grim mask. "We have a visitor." A cold dread trickled down Alara's spine. "The storm." He used the storm for cover, Silas finished, his eyes never leaving the dense woods. "Waited it out somewhere close. Took the horse when it broke." He looked back at her, his gaze intense. This wasn't random. He knew the horse was here. He's been watching. The idea of being watched, of an unseen presence lurking in the vast wilderness that surrounded them, was terrifying. Her sense of safety, so carefully nurtured over the past weeks, shattered. The homestead was no longer a sanctuary. It was a vulnerable, isolated target. "Who?" she whispered. "Could be anyone," he said, his voice grim. "A desperate trapper. A claim jumper. Someone from town who saw you leave with me." He looked directly at her, and she saw a flicker of something new in his eyes. A fierce, protective anger. Someone who thinks a lone woman makes this place an easy claim. The implication was clear. She was the reason for this threat. Her presence had brought danger to his door. Guilt washed over her, swift and sickening. "I'm sorry," she stammered. "I never meant to bring trouble." "This isn't your fault," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. "Trouble finds its own way out here. You just gave it a direction to walk." He checked the load in his rifle, his movements swift and sure. "He'll be back. He didn't just take the horse. He tested us. He'll be back for the rest." The rest. The cabin. The supplies. Her. The day passed in a state of high tension. Silas was a changed man. The quiet, methodical worker was gone, replaced by a vigilant, silent hunter. He reinforced the cabin door with a heavy bar. He checked the shutters on the windows, ensuring they were secure. He cleaned and oiled a second rifle, a heavy buffalo gun she hadn't seen him use before, and laid it on the table with a box of heavy cartridges. He said little, but his actions spoke of a grim preparation for a siege. Alara refused to be a helpless bystander. While he secured the perimeter, she took stock of their supplies. She filled every bucket and pot with fresh water from the creek, making quick, nervous trips while Silas stood guard. She prepared food that wouldn't need cooking, slicing meat, wrapping biscuits, so they wouldn't need to light a fire after dark and reveal their presence. Her fear was a cold knot in her stomach, but her hands were steady. The woman who had knelt in the dirt in redemption was gone. In her place was a woman who was preparing to defend her home. As dusk began to fall, Silas came back inside, his face grim. "He's out there," he said softly. "I found his tracks. He's circling, waiting for dark." He handed her a small pistol, its metal heavy and cold in her hand. "Do you know how to use this?" She shook her head, her eyes wide. He showed her, his instructions clipped and precise. How to load it, how to cock the hammer, how to aim. "Don't fire unless he's inside," he said. "Don't waste the shot. Aim for the center." His hands briefly covered hers, guiding her grip. His touch was firm, steadying. It was the touch of a soldier, a protector. Night fell like a black shroud. They extinguished the lantern, plunging the cabin into near-total darkness, relieved only by the faint, dying embers in the hearth. Silas took up a position by one of the front windows, cracking the shutter just enough to see out. He motioned for her to take the other. The silence was absolute, a stark contrast to the storm of the previous night. This silence was not peaceful. It was predatory. Every creak of the cabin settling, every rustle of leaves in the breeze, sent a jolt of adrenaline through her. Hours passed. The moon rose, casting long, eerie shadows through the pines. Alara's eyes ached from staring into the darkness. Her muscles were cramped and sore, but she did not move. Beside her, Silas was a figure of stone, utterly still, utterly focused. They were in this together, two lone figures braced against the coming violence. She thought of his wife, his daughter, lost to a sudden, brutal attack. He had been unable to protect them. She understood, with a sudden, piercing clarity, that he would not fail again. He was not just defending his home. He was defending the memory of theirs. And she, in turn, was not just defending herself. She was defending the man who had saved her, the quiet, broken man who had given her a chance at a new life. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a hard, cold resolve had formed. She would not be a victim. She would fight. The attack came with a sudden, shocking violence that shattered the night's stillness. There was no warning, no sound of approach. One moment there was silence. The next, the heavy thud of a log being slammed against the cabin door. The thick wood groaned, but held. Alara jumped, her heart leaping into her throat, the pistol feeling slick in her sweaty palm. Another crash, heavier this time, followed by a man's guttural curse from the darkness. "They're trying to break it down." Silas's voice was a low, calm growl from his position at the window. It was a strange comfort in the chaos. "There are two of them." Alara moved to her own window, her hands trembling as she nudged the shutter open a crack. In the pale moonlight, she could see two figures, burly, indistinct shapes wielding a heavy log as a battering ram. A third crash shuddered through the cabin, and she heard the wood of the door begin to splinter. They would be through in moments. "The window," Silas commanded, his voice sharp. "When I fire, they'll turn. That's your chance." He was not talking about her pistol. He was talking about the heavy buffalo gun on the table. He was trusting her to be more than a cowering victim. He was trusting her to be a partner. Fear and resolve warred within her. She had never fired a gun in her life. But the image of the splintering door, of the violence waiting just outside, galvanized her. She scrambled to the table, her hands finding the cold, heavy weight of the rifle. It was enormous, unwieldy. She propped it on the windowsill as he had positioned his own, the long barrel pointing out into the night. "Now!" Silas roared. The sound of his rifle firing next to her was deafening in the small space. It was a massive, concussive blast that filled the room with smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Outside, a man screamed, a high, thin sound of pain and surprise. The battering ram dropped to the ground with a thud. As Silas had predicted, the second man spun toward the source of the shot, momentarily silhouetted against the night. He raised his own rifle. Alara didn't think. She acted. She lined up the barrel as Silas had shown her, closed her eyes, and pulled the trigger. The kick of the big rifle was brutal, a solid punch that slammed her shoulder back into the wall and sent a shockwave through her entire body. Her ears rang, and for a moment, the world was nothing but noise and darkness. When her vision cleared, she peered back out the window. The second man was gone. There was no body, no sound, just the groaning of the wounded man on the ground and the deep, ringing silence that followed the gunfire. "Did I?" she whispered, her voice shaking. "You hit him or you scared him," Silas said, already reloading his rifle with swift, practiced movements. "Doesn't matter. He's running." He moved to the door, listening intently. The groans outside were growing weaker. The other one's not going anywhere. The immediate threat was over, but the cabin remained a tense, sealed fortress. They waited. The minutes stretched into an eternity. The wounded man's moans faded into a ragged, wet breathing, and then into silence. The night returned to its predatory stillness, but now it was a stillness tainted by the fresh memory of violence and the certain presence of death just outside their door. Silas did not relax his vigil. He moved between the windows, a silent specter in the dark, his rifle always ready. Alara remained at her post, the heavy gun still propped on the sill. Her shoulder throbbed with a deep, purple ache, a physical reminder of the boundary she had crossed. She had taken up a weapon. She had fired it with the intent to harm, to protect. The act had changed her, solidifying the steel that had been slowly hardening within her. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. The shared violence, the successful defense of their home, had forged a bond between them that words could not articulate. They were a unit, a partnership tested by fire. She glanced at him in the darkness, at his solid, unyielding silhouette. She saw not just a protector, but an equal, and she sensed that he, in that moment, saw the same in her. Dawn came slowly, hesitantly, a wash of pale gray light that revealed the carnage of the night. Silas finally unbarred the door, stepping out with his rifle held at the ready. Alara followed, her pistol in her hand. The air was cold and clean, but it smelled of gunpowder and blood. The man lay where he had fallen, a grim, still shape in the morning mist. He was a stranger, his face bearded and gaunt, his clothes rough. A drifter, a man whose desperation had led him to this fatal miscalculation. Silas checked the body with a detached, clinical air, then scanned the surrounding woods. "The other one's long gone," he said. "He left a blood trail, but he's not our concern anymore. He won't be back." There was the grim task of dealing with the body, a somber, silent affair that they undertook together. There was no ceremony, only the hard necessity of the task. Alara did not flinch. She did her part, her movements steady, her face set. The wilderness was a place of harsh realities, and she was learning to face them without illusion. When it was over, they stood by the broken corral fence, the rising sun casting long shadows behind them. The homestead was quiet, peaceful once more. But it was a different place now. It was a home that had been fought for, defended, and held. It was theirs, in a way it hadn't been before. Silas turned to her. The morning light softened the hard lines of his face, and for the first time, she could clearly see the exhaustion in his eyes. But there was something else there, too. A deep, quiet respect. "You were steady," he said. It was the highest praise he could offer, a simple acknowledgement of her strength, her courage. "You told me what to do," she replied, her voice still hoarse. "Telling's one thing," he said, his gaze holding hers. "Doing is another." He looked at her shoulder, where the stock of the rifle had bruised her. "You're hurt." "It's nothing," she said, but her voice wavered. The adrenaline was gone, leaving behind a bone-deep weariness and the dull, throbbing ache in her body and her soul. He reached out, his calloused fingers gently touching her shoulder. His touch was tentative, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through her that had nothing to do with pain. It was a touch of profound tenderness, a silent recognition of her sacrifice, of her transformation. "Alara," he said, and the sound of her own name, spoken in his low, rough voice, was a revelation. He had never used it before. It was always you. The simple act of naming her felt like a sealing of the pact between them. She looked up into his eyes, and in their depths, she saw the walls of his solitude finally beginning to crumble. The shared danger, the trial by fire, had done what weeks of quiet cohabitation could not. It had broken them both open, revealing the resilient, lonely souls within. In the quiet aftermath of the battle, surrounded by the silent, watching wilderness, they were no longer a man and a woman bound by necessity. They were Silas and Alara, and they had survived, together. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm established itself at the homestead, one born not just of necessity, but of a deep, unspoken partnership. The broken corral was mended, the splintered door replaced with a stronger one hewn from a massive pine. The physical scars of the attack were erased, but the change it had wrought upon them remained, a permanent shift in the foundation of their lives. The silence between them was no longer a space to be cautiously navigated. It was a comfortable, shared territory, rich with understanding. Alara's garden, which had survived the storm, began to flourish under her dedicated care. Small green shoots pushed through the dark earth, a vibrant, tenacious testament to life's persistence. The sight of it filled her with a profound, quiet joy. It was a promise fulfilled, a dream, not the one she had started with, but one she had built herself, with her own two hands. She was no longer tending a memory. She was cultivating a future. Silas, too, was changed. The impenetrable wall of his grief had been breached. He still spent his days in hard, solitary labor, but he was no longer entirely alone in his world. He would return to the cabin at dusk not just to a shelter, but to a home. He would find Alara there, a fire burning in the hearth, a simple meal waiting. He started talking more, not in long speeches, but in small offerings, fragments of his day or his thoughts. He told her about the habits of the deer that came to the creek at dawn, about the way the wind sounded in the pines before a snow. He began to share his world with her, the one he had inhabited alone for so long. One evening, he came in from the barn carrying a small, intricately carved object. He set it on the table in front of her. It was a bird, a hawk, its wings outstretched as if in flight. The detail was astonishing, every feather perfectly rendered, its eyes sharp and focused. It was a masterpiece of patience and skill. "For you," he said gruffly, not meeting her eyes. She picked it up, her fingers tracing the smooth, polished wood. It was beautiful, but it was more than that. The hawk was a survivor, a fierce and solitary hunter. It was a reflection of him, but she also saw herself in it now. The resilience, the sharp focus on survival. It was a gift of immense significance, a symbol of the strength he saw in her, the strength she had found in herself. "Thank you, Silas," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. It was gratitude, affection, and a deep, abiding sense of belonging. He merely nodded, but a faint, rare smile touched the corners of his mouth. That winter, the snows came, blanketing the world in a deep, silent white. They were isolated, cut off from the rest of the world, but for the first time in her life, Elara did not feel trapped. The cabin was a bastion of warmth and safety, stocked with the food they had harvested and preserved, the wood he had chopped. The long, dark evenings were filled not with fear, but with a quiet contentment. He would carve by the firelight, and she would mend their clothes or read from one of the few books on his shelf. They lived a simple, circumscribed life, but it was a full one, its richness measured not in possessions, but in shared purpose and mutual respect. She often thought of the woman she had been, the famished bride in a tattered dress, kneeling in the dirt. That woman was a ghost, a stranger from another life. The wilderness had not broken her, it had forged her. It had stripped away everything she thought she was and revealed the resilient, unyielding core within. And it had given her Silas, a man who had not offered her pity, but a chance. A man who had not tried to save her, but had given her the tools to save herself. One evening, as a blizzard raged outside, rattling the shutters and piling snow against the door, she looked at him across the small room. He was watching the fire, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. The hawk he had carved for her sat on the mantelpiece, its wooden wings spread against the stone. In that moment, she understood the truth of her journey. She had come to this place seeking survival, but she had found something more. She had found a home. She had found a partner. She had found herself. She had been brought to the edge of nothingness, to a place where all hope seemed lost. Yet, in the deepest despair, a hand had been offered. Not one of soft comfort, but one of rough, practical grace. A hand that offered bread, then shelter, then a spade, then a weapon. A hand that had, piece by piece, helped her rebuild a life from the ashes of another. She was no longer defined by what she had lost, but by what she had built. Here, in the heart of the vast, indifferent wilderness, two solitary souls had found each other, forging a bond stronger than any hardship. A quiet love story written not in words, but in shared silence, common labor, and the resilient, enduring act of survival. The wind howled, but inside the small, sturdy cabin, there was only peace.